Welcome for those that have joined us today. Realize that it is maybe a little bit late in the day. Please come in. Please come in.
Please.
We are talking today, Ridha and myself are talking today about Orientalist art, a tradition which actually spans, well over a century. And the reason why we called it the Chosen View is because it is actually mostly characterized by a small group of Western artists that traveled to the Middle East and there formed an almost idealized picture and showed their chosen view of the Middle East to the audience back home. And back home would be anywhere in Europe, basically. But it starts a little bit earlier than the 19th century, which was the heyday of Orientalism. Here you can see a picture by Jean-Baptiste Vermeer, who's considered one of the earliest Orientalist artists. He traveled to Constantinople at the invitation of the then French ambassador, who had as a project to paint 100 portraits of local citizens in Constantinople. And Vermeer was such a hit locally that he decided to stay there even when the French ambassador went back and made it his home. And subsequently, his mainstay of his oeuvre is depictions of the court in Constantinople and ambassadors arriving and giving their credentials to the Sultan. Here, another sort of 18th century Orientalist artist, Lyotard, also a resident of Constantinople for a while. He stayed there for 4 years and then traveled back. But he was so enamored with everything Turkish that he even dressed like in Turkish costume even when he was back home. So that earned him the name the Turkish painter. Just a tidbit of information that you didn't know. This is quite interesting. It's by Antoine de Favre. Favre was also traveled to Constantinople, made it his home, is mostly known for his sort of topographical paintings, was also almost acted like a spy for the French court, and the French court gave him the honorary title of principal painter of the Levant. But he might also, in his reports back, secretly have divulged military locations and garrison strength. Next painting. This is where it gets really interesting because this is in the time that Napoleon decided to take his campaign to Egypt. There was a sort of a huge tension, of course, between the French and the British. And Napoleon very much recognized, he was then General Bonaparte, very much recognized the strategic importance of Egypt and decided to launch a campaign there. He took with him a massive amount of scholars and writers, but also artists. And he appointed Vivant de Nom as his main, sort of the main person to document the monuments there. Denon was, quite famous for, after he returned, Napoleon was so grateful to him that when he became emperor, he actually also made Denon the director of the Louvre. And that's why there's now a Denon wing in the Louvre. So this is what you see here. You can see that it's, he took some liberties, but at least, that people kind of knew what was going on back home. The following artist, which is Baron Gros, was actually really wanted to go. He was far more, he really made it his mission to depict Napoleon in every heroic position you can possibly imagine, to ingratiate himself at court. Here we can see the pyramids where we were yesterday, and you can see how he puts Napoleon center stage. There's another painting by Gros where he actually where he visits the plague patients in Jaffa, and that is also depicted in a very sort of heroic way, like Napoleon the Savior, which is actually completely not true because he then subsequently poisoned 20 of his men because he didn't want the plague to spread. But anyway, so there's Gros. Next slide. I'm sorry if we're racing through this, but I mean, there's a lot of ground to cover in a way. Just to get you to the proper sort of Orientalist field, this is for me, one of the central artists of Orientalism. The reason why I put this picture in here is twofold. First of all, so this is a Jean-Léon Gérôme of Napoleon, but this scene could only have happened before 1801, and this painting actually dates from 1876. It's now in California in the Hearst collection. And this afternoon when we were at the Diplomatic Club, a sketch with dedication to one of his friends was actually hanging on the wall. So that was quite fun to see. Just sort of looping back to a bit earlier, if you can have the next slide. No, when I said looping back, it is the next slide after Jérôme. We're back in the time frame with the super romantic, time of Gros. Here's Horace Vernet. This is one of my favorite paintings. When I came to London, I couldn't wait to get to the Wallace collection to see this picture in real life. I think it's just incredibly romantic and it gives in essence, it's basically the complete romanticization of what was going on according to Western artists in the Middle East. But you have something to say about this artist too.
Oh, yeah. But first, I want to come back a little bit to that. You were speaking about the first time you went to London. I lived many years in Paris, and one of the first exhibitions I saw in Paris was an exhibition on Baron Dominique Vivant-Denon, who was, as Arne said, the first director of the Louvre Museum. Vivant-Denon was part of the Campagne d'Égypte, and Vivant-Denon was a very important part of this campaign, but also this campaign had a huge impact to what the Louvre Museum will be. He was the first director, not of the Louvre Museum, but what we call le Musée Universel, the Universal Museum at that time. Ironically enough, the Louvre Abu Dhabi will be called somehow like that, like centuries after. But what is very interesting is when Pierre Vivant-Denon went to Egypt, discovered Egyptians, and discovered also the culture and the excavations of Egypt describing the country, he brought back a lot of antiquities with him. And these antiquities and also other culture, material culture he brought back from Egypt inspired him when he was building the Universal Museum. And he was responsible of all the gathering of new collections from Italy, from Germany. He brought the Apollo of Kassel. He brought all these magnificent paintings, including paintings by Veronese, for instance, in the Louvre Museum. Some of them, like Le Noci di Cana, are still there. So Egypt, the pyramids, the Sphinx, had a huge impact on what is going to happen, not only in the art history of that time, in the late 18th century.
Think about how his whole, his book basically inspired also, furniture and I mean everything. All of a sudden, all the Egyptian themes
exactly
popped up.
The Egyptian themes, and it was really fascinating. And by the way, these Egyptian themes, the Orientalist, but also Neo-Orientalist, is quite fascinating, and especially in this room, because we are really in a room that has expressed that in this American university, who was somehow in the continuum of the spirit of rehabilitation or reinvestment of the Orient. But I just want to come back to two pictures. This one of, not Horace Vernet, of Le Baron Gros is quite fascinating, and also different paintings he did when he was in Egypt, but also this one, because the exploitation somehow of the Egyptian cultural heritage, but also artistic heritage, had a huge impact on museums in Europe, but it has also a huge impact on the politics in Europe. Arne has a really fascinating way of seeing paintings. I have also a different way of seeing paintings, because I understand that paintings are sometimes in a political moment, and what interests me also for me is how can you deconstruct from a painting like this one, where you see the grandeur of Napoleon and also his generals that are, you see the shadows of the generals in the corner in the back left, that's showing that Napoleon is somehow inscribed in eternity in front of this Sphinx, very, very brave and very standing really straight in front of this Sphinx. He is an expression of the greatness, not only of Napoleon, but also of the French Empire. But I don't want to take a lot of time on that. I want to go back on Horace Vernet, also one of my favorite painters. And Horace Vernet was also fascinating for me because this is one of the battles he represented. And what is fascinating for me is sometimes when you see also Orientalist painting, there is a local context, a local artistic context, a local Islamic, a context of Islamic art, a local context of people, ethnology, ethnography, but also what is interesting for me is also the question of the conquest, because the campaign of Egypt that somehow started this Orientalism was also a military campaign. But probably one of the most interesting artists, Horace Vernet, discovered North Africa and really started Orientalism when he traveled to Algiers in 1836. At the time, he was director of the Villa Medici in Rome. The king, Louis Philippe, asked him to go in Algeria to document what was the French army doing. So they sent to Horace Vernet a boat to pick him in Rome and to come to the south. Before the trip, the voyage in Italy, the trip in Italy was the real discovery of another world and another light. But when the roads of the southern shores of the Mediterranean were open, the artists were going there in a context of war. But at the same time, they were discovering a light, they were discovering a culture, they were discovering a new land that has been fascinating in the production, but also fascinating in the use of the color. And this is one of, somehow, it's a very violent scene, showing the French army in the city of Constantine fighting with the Algerians, but also this Orientalism is so much expressed also in this painting, in the dynamic, in the composition, and also the representation of the Arab people. When Horace Vernet went to Algeria, he said at that time, I saw for the first time people who were living in Abrahamic time. And this is a real Orientalism expressed through politics, but also imagination and representation. Oh, yeah, I mean, this is,
I needed to put that in.
Yeah. Before you speak about les femmes d'Alger, my professor of art history in Paris was the former president of La Sorbonne, Barthélemy Jobert, who is an expert of Delacroix, who wrote also books on Delacroix. This painting, I remember in my first year, when I arrived in La Sorbonne, he was obviously encouraging all the students to go to the Louvre. It was so easy for us to go and see it almost on a daily basis. He was telling me that it took them almost 2 months to find the shot to use in the publication of the book of Delacroix, because every single time they were taking a shot of this painting, with the hour changing, the colors of the painting was changing, and it was one of the few paintings in the Louvre that was changing with the hours of the day. Yeah. It was quite fascinating.
Well, so Eugène Delacroix, obviously trying to, or here going on his trip in, also in the 1830s to Algeria and Morocco, and showing here, I mean, two sides of the themes that he explored. There are endless amounts of his sketchbooks still available for study. And but the paintings are few and far between. There's, I think this one is in Hermitage. There are a few that are in private collection, but it's very few. I saw one. A friend of mine just sent me a photograph of one that is now in the museum in Qatar, and I think Delacroix was completely obsessed with going to North Africa and looking for new light and new atmosphere, but also new subject matter to explore. And it's really funny because like Baron Gros actually wrote about Delacroix, saying that he just thought it was the most horrific painting he ever saw. But his way of, his paint handling, etc., was quite revolutionary for that time. And I think he set a completely new tone of intimacy and documentation that's not so rooted in these large heroic paintings, these super romanticized paintings, but far more went into a sort of an almost an intimate form of depicting the Orient, or at least in this case North Africa, to make the viewer a part of the composition.
This is, and by the way, this painting is really, really fascinating for two reasons. Obviously, from an artistic perspective, it's absolutely one of the most beautiful painting from ever created at that period, and Delacroix was really a revolutionary painting. Le Baron Gros hated him because he was a student of David, such as Ingres, who were neoclassical painters, and Delacroix was bringing as also as some other painters, but really Delacroix and Géricault were expressing this new way of painting. But what is fascinating also in this painting, in Les Femmes d'Alger, is the question of going to the harem, going to the places where women were living, because usually at that time this space were female and also Muslim female and Algerian female, even though at that time we weren't talking about Algeria almost anymore, but that was colonized Algeria, which was a part of France. What was interesting is also Delacroix painting became also, and I don't want to talk too much about that, very polemic for a lot of people studying the colonial studies, because it's the white Western painter entering to the harem of the woman, which is really the last step for the Westerners. Where do you go? You conquest the land, then you conquest the people. But especially in Islamic culture, there is the moment also where you conquest the body of the woman. And Les Femmes d'Alger are also a step in the progression of colonialism and of a French colonial painting. But it's such also a beautiful, beautiful expression of French art of that time.
Of course, there are, the way Delacroix approached it with his observations of daily life were completely, one side of the spectrum of Orientalist. The other was, of course, all the exotic architecture that the artists wanted to document. And there are a number of artists, such as Luigi Meyer and Bossoli that we'll see next, and that really concentrated fully on the architecture and wanted to create these sort of expansive views for people to be familiarized with what it actually looked like in the Middle East. This is Jerusalem, and if you move to the next slide, you can see here, this is a view of Constantinople by Bosley. And you can't imagine the scale of this thing, and it's actually on paper, it's a pastel.
How big it is?
It's really, anyway, it actually depicts a fire in the Western Quarter. But yeah, we sold this, I don't know, 10 years ago. It just came to mind, so I had to put it in. Let's move on. David Roberts is definitely, when we're talking about really making a documentation of the Middle East, you have to mention David Roberts. David Roberts traveled extensively through the Middle East, but also meticulously held records and did these fabulous drawings and watercolors, and they were ultimately, he brought them back, and some of them he reworked on the basis of his drawings, and ultimately published them in a massive, massive collection of, I think there are 12 volumes. I once saw at a collector, they do exist. It's a special built bookcase where actually these things slot in, but a massive collection, almost an encyclopedia of views of the Middle East. He also, I mean, apart from being a fantastic draftsman and watercolorist, he also worked in oil. But it's really funny because he wasn't quite a revolutionary artist, but he did actually try to experiment a little bit with working from dark to light, and used the bitumen base, and a lot of his paintings are actually in terrible condition because of it, because they separate. But so his watercolors are the ones that you see a lot in museum collections, etc. Although there's a really wonderful Roberts in Sharjah.
Sharjah.
Yeah.
Representing the Temple of Bel, I think, or Temple of Bel in Palmyra, or Baalbek.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Baalbek,
yeah.
yeah.
He traveled, yeah, but this drawing of this watercolor of Cairo is absolutely sublime. And what is interesting is also how these artists were also somehow almost an architects. They're inspired a lot of architects because it was a very important sources for them also of knowledge of Islamic art, of Islamic architecture, because today we are so used of the representation of images, pictures, the mobility of the images instantly. When you take a picture, a digital picture, share it on social media. But
Yeah, although I was very disappointed not being able to take a snap of Tutankhamun. But
yes, definitely. Some of them, some people can do that. But what I mean is, at that time, the role of the artist was not only a role of someone reproducing views and also having access to different lands, being commissioned sometimes in missions like different missions sent by governments to have a knowledge of different countries, such as La Campagne d'Égypte, but they were really also very important cultural intermediary, bringing to the West a knowledge of landscape, of architecture, of people through their genre scenes. And they were very, very important elements for the West of knowledge of what was happening in North Africa and the Middle East in general.
True. Further going on in that tradition, in that British tradition of the watercolors, here you see John Frederick Lewis, RA, Royal Academy. These are two very important paintings or one watercolor and one painting that I was fortunate enough to be able to handle in my career selling Orientalist art. And this one is now in an institution, and this one is now privately owned. Can we go back to say? It's really funny because you think that this is all observation in a sense, like John Frederick Lewis really lived. He lived for a long time in the Middle East, and what we here see, for instance, is actually work that he executed when he was back in England. But it's fantastic to just take all these little different elements that you see as recurring elements in his work, because he had a great love, for instance, for textiles, and some of his textiles are still in the V&A. And we actually managed, when I was researching this picture, we actually managed to identify multiple elements, one of the shawls that's actually depicted here that used as a turban is actually the pashmina of his wife. There's a jacket up there with a Herman trim, which also is visible in a portrait of his wife. You see a couple of these elements all come back, and that is because the tradition of Orientalism as they knew it was actually evolving. There were a lot of these artists that came back to their studio in both Paris or in London and brought back masses of objects, and they kind of recomposed their ideal. They took these elements, and you see with this artist, but you also see it with Ernst and Ludwig Deutsch, all these Orientalist artists. You can actually, if you put certain pictures in the oeuvre together, you can actually identify, oh, that lamp he used to own, and that lamp, because these things come back. But I love this picture because when we were researching it, it was so fantastic to see all these elements, which were references to his wife, come back in this picture.
I don't know who was the painter, but I remember seeing different painters for the same school, using one object brought back from Cairo and depicting it in the same painting, because sometimes it was like a rare resource for them. So they were always, they used to have this mise en scène, as you can see here on the left, and using objects of Islamic art to be able like to own it, their own painting. But unfortunately I can't remember.
I think it can be Ernst and Ambrose because they worked in the same studio. So you can, that is possible.
Yeah.
But we don't know. Gustav Bauernfeind is an artist that I find fascinating because he really made it his mission to document daily life. And he went so far as to sometimes put himself even in the scene. I couldn't find an image of it which wasn't really grainy, so I'll spare you that. But there is even a painting that he made that is actually in an Egyptian collection where he put himself in the center of the painting, being swarmed by local population. Because they all wanted, they all wanted his attention in a way. He was in Damascus for a long time, and he kept a journal, so we know exactly when some of these paintings were actually painted or how they came into being. The warden of the mosque, for instance, is quite fascinating because he writes in his journal literally that he saw this side door. And that he waited for it to be opened to see what lay beyond, and because of his interest, he then asked if he could actually make some sketches, because these paintings are all huge panels. They were all done back in his local studio, so they were not plein air paintings. He didn't sit there with an easel to paint these huge compositions, but he did ask for permission and had to pay for the privilege of having the door open long enough to sort of kind of create this composition and paint the warden.
This one on the left is a ceremony. I don't know which one it is, but it's inside the Umayyad Mosque, Umayyad Mosque of Damascus, and you can recognize on the left the big stones, because the Umayyad Mosque was a permanent transformation of the temple of Zeus in Damascus. And you can see here on the left the big rocks of the temple, and then it became a basilica in the Byzantine time, and you have like the mosaics on the top left, and at the end you can see all the Islamic elements. This is really an absolutely beautiful view with a beautiful perspective. And inside the mosque you have what the Muslims say the tomb of Saint John Baptist. So you have visits usually from the tomb, and I wonder if this scene is one of these sacred visits to the tomb or not.
I'd have to reread his journal again. But it's funny because it's from a series of two views. So this is the west gate, and then he did another gate. And the other one is in an institution. This one is in a private collection.
Should we?
Yeah, sorry. Jérôme, back to Jérôme. Because that was actually something that I wanted to say about these. When we go to Bauernfeind, there you really see that it's all about the architecture, and then they basically put in, they create this sort of mise en scène of what their idealized view is. It's exactly the same thing here, of course. These are he's playing with different objects. Jérôme here is just creating this sort of complete idealized tableau, playing with colors, showing the richness of color, of fabric, basically showing off his fantastic skill in creating all these pelts and fabrics. It was quite a humorous painting.
This one's really beautiful.
Yeah,
and they are both beautiful, and the quality of the production of Jérôme is absolutely.
Oh my God, it's fantastic. But I mean, it's so academic. It's so fine that you literally can go. You can zoom in as far as you like. You just go with a magnifying glass. Everything is, done with a one hair brush. But it's amazing. This one is again here in Egypt.
And what is also fascinating about, it's especially with the painting that are so realistic, because locally, the local tradition of painting came very, very late by local painters. A lot of the first collectors, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, but a lot of the first Arab collectors who were collecting paintings were collecting these kind of paintings, because for them it was like the roots of on also photographs of that time, because for them it was the roots of the representation of their own land, when the Islamic tradition at that time wasn't matching this degree of representation, but it was much more symbolic, much more schematic. And this is extremely interesting also, not only for the representation, the impact of the representation and the ideas of the East or the Orient, or I would say North Africa and the Middle East, in Europe and in America sometimes, but also for local population here, decades after these paintings were done.
This is just to show you the sort of the depth of artists. I mean, Ludwig Deutsch is one of the greats out of the Orientalist art school, and you know, it's observations of his own. You know, he composes his own observations, of course, but they are rooted in truth. Once again, here using objects that he collected on his travels, creating these fantastic compositions, but they are, you know, his compositions. These are not like whatever. They have a degree of verisimilitude, but they're not real observed scenes. If we move on, I'm quite keen to get. Oh yeah, now this is Rudolf Ernst that I was talking about. Here you see all these fantastic objects. Once again, Ernst didn't travel very extensively to the Middle East, but he did collect a massive amount of objects. His studio looked like a, you know, an homage to the East. This actually here he places these people in the Alhambra, and uses actually basically a European location, and fantasizes what it would have been like in during
almost like the pictures of Pierre Loti, completely recreating the Orient and a location in the West in Paris.
And I think with Ernst you can, as much as you know, as much as Gérôme is also, you know, still rooted in, because he was a history painter originally, rooted in trying to make his observations as realistic as possible, and then translated them, you know, with academic skill. Ernst is all about the stage set and the, you know, evoking you know, the richness of culture and the richness of objects, far more than what is actually going on. So, then of course, because it became incredibly fashionable, you had these artists that didn't really travel that much to the Middle East, but had a massive oeuvre of these just, you know, fun little paintings that they basically churned out in mass production. And they were hugely successful, but they had a great function because they actually made the genre itself incredibly popular. And the Orientalist paintings all of a sudden started to really also create a market in America. The great sort of, you know, Gilded Age families started collecting Orientalist. And as I said, the Gérôme was with Hearst, but the Vanderbilts had a great collection of Orientalist paintings, etc., etc. So I mean, there is a bit of a debt to these bread painters in a way, that they spread the message far and wide. It was very interesting what you said about Delacroix, because the reason why I put this picture up is because at a later stage, the Orientalist artists were really accused of just, you know, not giving a true rendering of what life was actually like. And one of the examples that was always used is men can't go into the harem, so there's no, how do they know? But this, Frederick Bridgman, American Orientalist, was actually granted access, and his paintings from the 1870s are incredibly rich, and but also are a real documentation of what was going on and what life was like in the harem. So I thought that's why I wanted to.
This one was. Do you know if it was in the Ottoman Empire or North Africa? Because in the Ottoman, I mean, in Turkey or in North Africa?
No, North Africa. This
North
is
Africa.
yeah. He went to. It's in Morocco.
because also as you said, like one of the elements they were accused of is really the representation, idealization, representation, and transformation of the woman. And probably not in these paintings, but paintings like Angre, where he's representing a lot of Turkish bath, and Hammam, where he was representing women, naked women. There was this fantasy.
Yeah, Jerome did that as well, of course.
Yes,
Yeah.
this fantasy about the Orient, and obviously somehow in this fantasy of representation of the Oriental, Middle Eastern woman, it was an expression also of these, what some people would call a Western dominance. And obviously there was these...
I think you're going to a completely different thing here.
No, but I mean,
I know
if I should put it like very, very, yeah, of course, but if I should put it very simple, if a single man travel in all these regions, suddenly his eye is transformed, his taste is transformed, his will of representation is transformed, but also the access of to the woman and the will of access of the woman is also gradual when you see it in the Orientalist painting. And then it became very different in photography. And in photography, you see also different elements of representation of the woman as being very part of the scene, part of the daily life, but also being an erotic element, and sometimes even more than that. And this is also one of the elements where historians think that Orientalist paintings started also a fashion, that is not starting a fashion, but a representation of the dominance of some people and some also regions over others. And obviously the body of the woman and representation of the woman is something so, I mean, an element so sensitive and so representative also of the will of the painters. But this painting is very interesting because in that case, I love the way you're smiling, but that case, yeah. Because it's very interesting for me to see it as a social objects, historical objects, where we see the politics beyond the representation. But you are right. I mean, and sometimes in the paintings of Brigman, but also later in Diné, sometimes these elements are very, very interesting, depending also where the painter represents or positions himself.
Yeah, true. This is also North Africa. I just wanted to loop him in because he was there at the same time. But once again, it's very much I think, market scenes, etc. He didn't have any of the access that Bridgman had. So you can see that his documentation of life is completely different in a way. There's less rich. He's far more sort of trying to depict daily life.
It's a beautiful depiction of daily life and a beautiful capture of the light also. Yeah,
absolutely. I agree. There are a couple of artists that were very active in North Africa. Fromentin is one, and he's basically the one who started a tradition that we see then later on as well. These endless falcon hunts and this fascination with the Arab horse. If you go to the next one, you can sort of see the relation and the evolution. Yeah. Because here you see that there's a far more a looser palette coming. People were less academic. If we just flip back, because this is it's a matter of years in a way. But you see how academically trained somebody like Fromentin, who's really quite tries to render every hair, etc. At least on his on his horses and things. And then if we go back or forward to Rousseau, who's very much into, he wanted to capture far more the light and the dynamism of the scene. So it was certainly not a static portrait the way Fromentin did it. No. Here is really, that horse is really ready to go, and the birds are in flight. So.
And what is interesting is also Rousseau is one of these painters who was also representing so many scenes of North Africa. Through the lens, sometimes observing really North Africans. He had like an approach, a very different approach of how he were representing the people and also the surrounding of these people. Etienne Diné.
You can't, you can't speak about North Africa and then not include Diné, who used a far more sort of modern way of expressing himself than his fellow Orientalist artists.
We'll go very quickly on the last slide. Because,
Okay, let's go.
yeah.
Let's go.
And
Majorel, I needed to include him because I'm sort of fascinated. We keep talking about oil painters and watercolorists, etc. Majorel is fantastic because he tries to even explore new methods. He uses silver dust. He uses part of photography or elements that are also used in photography and mixed media, which I've always found added a completely new dimension to it.
And also he has really an incredible approach of the land of the territory in Morocco. He almost sees different layers of the society, but also at the same time of the geography and the topography and the way Moroccans were living at that time.
So we have spoken a lot about artists that were actually traveled there and who were inspired. The Orientalist theme continued, but for instance, here you have Renoir. This is the wife of a local carpet dealer in Paris, who he decided that he wanted to paint. So never traveled there completely, made up scene in a way, but just an exploration of color. Still, I think, fantastic and evocative picture.
Yeah.
But here you can also speak of the undercurrent of, he had his ideas about this.
But this generation of painter the Impressionist was also this is also one of the layers that people, maybe one of the aspects that people don't know a lot. They were really influenced by North Africa because a lot of them, when the war between France and Germany happened in the 80s, 70s, a lot of them were doing their military service in Algeria, among them Monet. And the light they were perceiving and seeing, especially for a generation of painters who didn't have a lot of money, not traveling like Monet and Degas. Manet and Degas. Monet didn't have a lot of money. There was also a very important opportunity for them to discover the territory of North Africa and discover a new light, as you saw in the...
Yeah, if they lived.
Sorry?
If they lived. I mean, like Basile.
Yeah, definitely.
Very small.
Oh, this is a view of... Yeah, this is a view of
have to put Tunisia in there.
Yeah. We have to put Tunisia. I'm Tunisian, by the way, so no. Okay, خلاص. So I'm because I said Tunisia, you said خلاص. Well, but this is a view of Tunisia of Kandinsky. This is probably one of the most interesting late travel or what at that time was supposed to be Orientalist, but will change very, very quickly in North Africa, where he depicted and changed his use of color in a very transformative and fast way that really impacted and influenced a lot the shapes of his shapes and colors in the following year, coming back from North Africa in Tunisia. And probably one of the most beautiful examples is Klee. Klee, what is called the Tunis Reisen, when he went with Macker in 1914, right before the war, where he was discovering North Africa, discovering the colors of North Africa. But what was really, really fascinating with him is for the first time, the elements we saw with Arne, these different elements of Islamic art, carpets, textile, ceramics, silver objects, bronze objects, were really absorbed by the artists. Because when you see Klee really started creating this geometry, this systematic geometry somehow of his composition in Tunisia, when he started seeing these carpets, seeing craft developed in Tunisia, and also really absorbing the light. And this is something he said in his beautiful correspondence of his trip, the Tunis Reisen. He was saying the light is gently and strongly, oh my God, I forgot how he was saying that, gently and strongly penetrating my art. And this trip was a complete revolution in his art production of that time.
Yeah, that's superb. We made it.
We made it? Oh, should we? This is probably the last slide, but don't worry. This is a work of Ali Sherry exploring a little bit, like really a different look on these Orientalist and trip of tourists made in the first half of the 20th century. And that was a little bit a joke, a way to show you this work that is coming up to auction next week in London, and also an interpretation by a contemporary Lebanese artist, French Lebanese artist now, I guess, of this generation of people coming in this land and how they were perceiving, captivating this land and bringing it back as a form of memory. Thank you very much for your
Thank you very much.
Arne. Sorry.
Thank you.